Okay, now we're going to continue with the second part on positioning. Now what we're going to do is we discuss what positioning is, right? Positioning is about how people perceive your brand, right? How it's your brand in their minds. So the first thing that comes to mind when you say Volvo, right? It's usually the answer is safety or safe cars, right? So that's your positioning. Now, the key question is how can you measure that, right? Because if you cannot measure something, it's hard to manage, right? So because of that, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss a particular technique that is oftentimes used for assessing positioning, and these are called perceptual maps. So let's talk a little bit about perceptual maps. Now, what is a perceptual map? It's essentially a visual tool that tries to capture the positioning of different brands in the marketplace, right? So it's trying to basically, by capturing the perceptions of people, it could be one customer, it could be a group of customers, right? And it's trying to basically get at the question, how is your brand perceived by your customers relative to the competition? So it's trying to basically assess the entire positioning landscape using something that can be visually displayed, and because of that, perceptual maps are usually in either 2 or maybe 3 dimensions, right? Going beyond 3 dimensions is mathematically tractable and possible, but as human beings, we have a hard time visualizing anything past 3 dimensions. In fact, if you ask me, 3-dimensional diagrams tend to be hard to understand. So because of that, oftentimes, even if you go to 3 dimensions, you might use a collection of 2-dimensional diagrams to capture that, okay? And now, the way you actually do this from a technical standpoint, and I don't want to get too much into the details, is it could be based on attributes, right? And then essentially what you do is you look at the product category, you create a laundry list of the top attributes that matter or are important in this particular product space. And based on that, you have people evaluate all these products or services along that list of important attributes. Okay, and based on that and using some math that I'm not gonna get into in class, but if you're interested, let me know, because this is the kind of stuff that got me into marketing. So it's something that I'll be happy to explain if you're interested. So using some math, you can reduce all that list of attributes to 2 dimensions that are gonna be the ones that you're gonna use for the diagram, and you're gonna plot the brands in there, right? The other way to do this is using similarity, where essentially what you do is you create a little postcard with each of the brands, and then you give customers the possibility of ordering those brands in terms of how similar or different they are to each other. So at the top and the bottom, you'll have the most different brands, and everything in between will be brands that are closer to the one before, but far away from the ones that are farther away. And if you do this exercise, and again, you use some math, something called multidimensional scaling, you can actually get a diagram, a map of all those brands in a 2-dimensional space. So they look kind of like this, right? So here you have beer again. By the way, I think I mentioned not a big beer drinker, but maybe you won't suspect it by looking at the materials that I use in class. Beer is a fascinating product category, though, because while there are obviously product attributes that are very objective, oftentimes is highly susceptible to the messaging aspect of it, right? So I find it fascinating that way. Wine is even more than this, if you ask me, but that's just me. Anyway, so here you have some beer brands, and here you have some axes, right, that I've drawn there in the middle. And so you have your x-axis, which I'm going to call x, and sorry, but it doesn't look pretty. And then you're going to have your y-axis here, right? And so this tells you how the brands stack relative to each other. So you can see that here Beck's and Heineken are perceived quite similarly by this set of customers, or Old Milwaukee and Meister Brau. Okay. On the other hand, Michelob and Stroll are seen fairly different from each other. In fact, they are pretty far apart. Probably the farthest apart is Michelob from Old Milwaukee. right? So these customers think that some of these beers are very different from each other, other beers are very close to each other. Okay, but the question is, what the heck are X and what the heck are Y, right? What are these things that we're plotting here? Okay, do we have an idea about what these metrics mean? Okay, so let me show you a little bit more in detail what kind of data is behind these two axes that I've created here. Okay, if you use the attribute method, which is the only one that I'm going to discuss in this class because I think it's a little bit easier to understand. The math, it's not that simple, but we're not going to go through the math, so you don't need to worry about it. But I want you to understand at least where the data is coming from. So what I plotted here is I plotted a set of questions, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 questions that the market researcher has used to create this two-dimensional diagram. So behind all those dots that you say in the previous slide where the brands were, there are 13 variables that you are asking questions to your customers about. Okay, and these questions could be something simple like a Likert scale that goes from 1 to 7, where you make a statement like, this beer is heavy. Okay, and then 1 strongly disagree, 7 strongly agree, and any gradation in between. Okay, this beer is full-bodied, right? This beer is a kind of beer that usually blue-collar people will drink. Okay, this beer is a good value, and then for all of this, you're gonna go strongly agree to strongly disagree, right? On a budget, pale color, light, less filling. You see the point, right? So there are all these attributes, right? There are all these attributes. And what we're going to do is we're going to essentially collapse all these 13 attributes to just 2 dimensions, just 2. Okay? And these 2 dimensions, they don't have their name. And we, as statisticians or marketers, or a combination of statisticians and marketers, we are going to name them. Okay, and the way you're going to name them if you use an attribute-based model is by plotting these variables, the original data that you actually had, and of course the computer will do this for you, but by looking at how some attributes are going to be very close to the axis, right? So you can see here, heavy and light are very close, and not only they are very close, but they are almost perpendicular to each other, which makes sense, right? So in a situation like this, you can use these 2 attributes to basically name that axis. Okay. If you don't have the attribute-based data, naming the axis is more difficult. But I'm not going to get into that now because that's not what we're going to be doing. So now we can overlay all the information that we have, both the brands and the attributes together. So let me recap how you will interpret this, each of the components here. So we have the axis, right, which we still don't know how to name, although I've given you guys some hints from the previous slide. Okay, and then we have the brands, which are located based on the perception that these customers have. So brands that are close together will mean that they are perceived as similar, and brands that are far apart from each other, they will be considered dissimilar or different, okay, by consumers. So maybe not competing for the same space or the same sales. Okay, good. So that's the first part, the brands. And then you have these attributes, right? These attributes that are not always shown, but if you've collected the data, you have this data, right? And the attributes increase in the direction that the arrow indicates, right? So here, popular with men, for example, it's something that increases in this direction, okay? So the farther out you are in this direction, indicated here, the more likely you are to be attractive to this segment of males in this particular data case, okay? And the opposite to that, like if you go on the opposite direction, right, it will be less attractive. I think everybody gets that, right? But one thing that you should notice is that not all arrows have the same length. And the reason why that is because you are taking 13 variables and you are collapsing them to 2, right? You are plotting everything in 2 dimensions. So there are only 2 numbers. If you remember your Math 101 class, every point in here, it's uniquely categorized by 2 numbers. 2 numbers are on this darker axis that I've created, right? So when you take 13 variables, these are all numbers, right? And you collapse everything to 2, you lose information in the process, right? Now, what the length of the arrows indicates is the amount of variance or information, if variance is something that you're not familiar with, information that is still maintained by the axis, by the 2 axes from the original variable. So there are some variables, right, that have much longer, like premium, for example, right? Longer arrows, that means that they are very well explained by this diagram, these 2-dimensional diagrams. And there are other axes, like blue color, for example, that are a lot shorter. So that means that if you use this 2-dimensional diagram, some of the information in blue color, maybe a large chunk of it will be lost. Okay, and that's something that's a compromise that you're going to have to live up with. Okay, but at least you know. Now, what you can do to name this axis is you can use these attributes. How do you do that? Well, the closer an attribute is to the axis that you're trying to name, like for example in the case of heavy, right? Heavy is pretty close to this, like the angle between these two is very close, very small, right? And the longer that arrow is, the better of a candidate is that question for being used as the axis name. Okay, so you can see here heavy and light go hand in hand here. They are both long and close to the axis. Same thing with premium. And here, instead of good value, we just change it to budget, as you know, something that will be opposite to what is on the other side of this spectrum, right? But I want you guys to realize that it's the angle and the length that is going to determine which one of these attributes or variables are going to be used to name the axis. Okay, if you use a similarity-based method, you do not have this data, so you need to get more creative. I'm not going to get into how you do it then, because we're not going to see it. Okay, good. Now, this is kind of a reiteration of the same thing that I've said, right? The arrows indicate how the attributes increase, right? And the length of the arrow tells me about the variance that is explained by the 2-dimensional graph, which we're going to call the perceptual map. Okay, so the longer it is and the closer it is to the axis, the more likely it is a good candidate to name the axis. Okay, and then finally, if you're interested in knowing how each of the brands scores in any of the attributes, all you need to do is take the dot that indicates where the brand is in the diagram and create a little dotted line or a little line that is perpendicular to the variable or the arrow that you're interested in. Okay, and that's going to tell you how it scores relative to that particular attribute. Okay. This obviously can be done mathematically, even though you actually technically have the data. Okay, good. And here you have a graphical depiction of what I just described. So you can take any of the brands, like All Milwaukee, for example, and you can obviously see how they score in terms of the main axis by just throwing an array. Okay, not surprised, you're used to that. Okay, but you can do the same thing with any of the other axes. So for example, here you have on a budget, right? If you want to know how it scores relative to that, what you will do is you will throw an array that is perpendicular to that particular vector, right? Perpendicular means a 90-degree angle like this. This is supposed to be 90 degrees, although my drawing skills with the mouse are subpar, so you may or may not be able to see it right. And you can do the same thing with any other vectors, right? So you can also do that with the original vector light, which is different than what we call here like heavy and light. And to do that, we'll just throw an array like this. And again, this is supposed to be a 90-degree angle with this vector over here. And that number right here, which you can measure, the distance between the 0 and this number, is what it will score according to the diagram on the light scale. You know, it's a light beer or something like that. Okay. Now I'm going to show you another example that is not beers, because not beers. So here you have soap, right? Soap. Actually, next case, I think we're going to discuss beauty products. So I guess this is relevant, right? So here you have some brands like Dove, Zest, Safeguard, Coast, etc. Right? You can see them here, and I've done the same exercise. Collect information about a set of attributes. You have a set of brands. We've derived a two-dimensional perceptual map, and it looks like this. You can see some brands are close together. So brands are close together over here. They seem to be quite different, right? Why are they different? Well, these ones are deodorant, meaning they have some sort of smell, and these are non-deodorant, right? But they're both highly moisturized. Moisturizer, okay? Now, the difficulty with diagrams like this is they tell you what the perceived positions are, but there is something that is conspicuously missing here, right? Because if you're trying to launch, for example, a new brand, somebody might say, well, look, these spaces are all crowded. There is a bunch of brands, but there is nobody over here. Look at all this space. So why don't we launch something that is not deodorant and not highly moisturizer? Okay, maybe that kind of soap will do well because there's no competition in that space, right? Okay, that's a train of thought, but there's a problem with that argument. What's missing in the map? The map just tells me what the brand's perceptions are. It doesn't tell me what the customer cares about. So what we're missing are the preferences from the consumers. And if you look at this diagram, in that area that I drew before, there are no customers. Nobody prefers that combination that I just outlined. Okay, so because of that, if we launch a brand right here, right, we're going to do poorly because there are no customers that prefer something that is low moisturizing and non-deodorant, right? That combination is just not preferred by pretty much anybody, right? Pretty much anybody. So what you need to do is not only you need to get information about how people perceive the brands, but ideally also ask them, what is your ideal product? So if you could have your ideal product, how will it score in these different questions that you're asking me, right? And then you can place your customers. By the way, the sizes of the bubbles here indicate the number of people that correspond to that group or segment. In this case, we have 8 segments, as you can see, right? You might have a smaller number of segments. That's fine, okay? But once that you actually have this information, you are seeing 2 things. Not only you can see how the brands stack to each other, but also you can see how close they are to different segments or different target segments that you might have, right? If you're trying to if you're trying to go for segment 2, right? But this is your positioning, you're obviously not doing a good job, right? Because you're really far apart. On the other hand, if your goal is to target segment 1, then you're doing a great job because you're almost the closest brand in the marketplace to that segment. So that will indicate that segment 1 really likes your product, okay? Because you're very close to their ideal combination of benefits in this particular product category. Now, we've talked about positioning, but like something that I've been mentioning several times, positioning is a strategic variable, right? That determines how it is that you want to be perceived by the customers. But one important aspect of making sure that that positioning actually happens is by messaging appropriately, by communicating appropriately with your target segment, okay? So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to make sure that whatever points you're trying to achieve strategically, they are hammered down in the messaging area to make sure that there is a one-to-one mapping between what it is that you're doing and what it is that you're saying. Okay, these things need to talk to each other and they need to be in line. Okay, there are slight differences, right? Because positioning tends to be more about being creative and doing things in a way that is unique and memorable, but the message itself should be congruent and consistent with the positioning that you're trying to achieve. So here you have some typical taglines from companies, right? Companies that have pretty clear and well-defined positioning strategies, right? Like for example, Nike, right? Nike is a brand that I really, really like from a marketing perspective. Why? because it's a company that has gone beyond just talking about shoes and talking about helping athletes become their best, right? And that's something that enables you to expand your brand into many different areas, right? Anything that is going to be helpful for you as an athlete, it's fair game for Nike, right? So you can have training apps. It's not just about the merchandise, okay? And one simple but powerful way of encapsulating that message is this idea of just do it, right? Because one of the reasons why athletes are not as good as they could be is the athlete itself, right? What I mean by this is we tend to be our worst enemy, right? How many times do you choose to just sit and watch, I don't know, whatever you watch? I was going to say a movie, but maybe a movie is not the right term. And do something that you find fun and enjoyable by sitting on the couch instead of going for a run, especially when it's cold and raining, right? So this tagline of just do it, capturing this essence behind Nike trying to help you be the best athlete that you can be. And by the way, if you go to their website and you look at their athlete, there's a little asterisk in there, which I think is genius, right? And if you go to the bottom, it will say athlete. Well, you know, I'm not an athlete, right? But they say, no, yes, you are an athlete, right? If you have a body, you are an athlete, right? So this is for everybody. It's not just for one person. And you have a bunch more taglines that, you know, creatively capture their positioning. And you have some examples here, right? KFC, Coke, these are all brands that you know. I don't need to tell you. You can just look through the slide. And that's all I have for you guys when it comes down to positioning. I will see you in the next class.